Roads go ever, ever on, over rock and under tree, by caves where never sun has shone, by streams that never find the sea. Roads go ever, ever on, under cloud and under star, yet feet that wandering have gone will turn at last to home afar. Over snow by winter sown, and through the merry flowers of June, over grass and over stone, under the mountains in the moon, roads go ever, ever on, over rock and under tree, by caves where never sun has shone, by streams that never find the sea.
So, yet another live. And are we talking today about travel or about adventure? Can we even draw a distinction? But here today with us is Andrew Chaney, who is teaching a course this coming fall on travel literature. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the video that we saw there of The Hobbit. You know, one of my favorite books, and definitely dealing with travel and the journey. And that song there reminded me a little bit of the Weavers, and Pete Seeger had that kind of a feel to it. It really goes well with kind of the folk idiom of The Hobbit. So I really, really enjoyed that. Thank you for providing that.
Oh, my pleasure. I mean, there's so much nostalgia. Yeah, well, I mean, you know, for us, those of us who read the book as a kid, there's so much nostalgia there. That cartoon, that particular cartoon, has a lot of nostalgia for me. You know, my beard is a lot whiter than I think yours would be, a lot whiter. So yeah, that cartoon is really just so nostalgic for me, and nostalgia itself, you know, is one of the things that travel tugs at, and longing is one of the things that travel tugs at. So I'm really excited to talk with you about travel and books about travel and all of that.
Yeah.
So before we do that, let's actually just hear from you about who you are and what you're into, and why you're teaching this course at Kepler.
So I am originally from Miami, Florida. I grew up there, spent 13 years there. Then in 8th grade, I moved to Cookeville, Tennessee, which is in the middle of the state. We're about an hour away from Nashville. And I've always loved traveling and books and literature. My mom was a 1st grade teacher, so every summer we would go a different place. So I haven't been to all 50 states, but I've been to most of them, and really gotten to see parts of the country that I'm very fortunate to have gotten to experience. Went to Boston and did some whale watching once upon a time. We went to the artist or the author graveyard while we were there. Saw Emily Dickinson and T.S. Eliot's grave. Saw Walden. I got to go to Walden Pond, which was really cool. I'd love to go back, because when we went, I was really young and didn't really understand the magnitude of what I was seeing, because I would read Walden later and really understand what that meant and what he did. And really, he wasn't that far from town. He was only 2 miles away. But he really created for himself that kind of traveler's mindset, or explorer's mindset. So I really grew up as a traveler, but also as a reader. Always loved books. I always remember my parents reading to me, and always having a book, or going to the bookstore with my parents or grandparents and buying books. It wasn't until my mom I think, I don't remember when she found the book. Actually, we watched the documentary on Discovery Channel called Walking the Nile with Levison Wood, where he walks from the source of the Nile to the Mediterranean Sea. So he does not use any sort of transportation at all except for his own 2 feet. And watched the series and found out that there was a book that corresponded with that. My mom bought the book. We both read it. We both loved it. Had never read really any travel literature before then, but that book really fostered my love of travel literature and really taught me a lot about the travel literature that I had probably missed out on because I had never read any. Just because Levison is a student of history, student of the explorers that came before him, so there are a lot of historical references to people like Bruce Chatwin. Or the Victorian explorers, even before Chatwin. So I learned a lot about those people, and then from that book, read a lot more travel literature that I felt like I probably missed out on because I was reading, other things and didn't even really know that travel literature was a genre. I always thought it was maybe, like a guidebook or you get an atlas and you've got those sorts of things, which are part of travel literature, but it's not really literature. It's more of like a travel guide and kind of planning your vacation sort of thing. But really, once I read that book, I was off and running with a love for the travel literature genre and really wanted to teach this course because in one of my courses that I taught for Tennessee Tech University here in Cookeville, I used a part of Levison's book, Walking the Nile, to do a literary analysis. And the students just absolutely loved it. They wish we could have read the whole book. And I wish we could have too, but we only had so much time for that project. But that got me thinking, what if I did a whole course on travel literature? So that was the germ of the idea came from a composition course that I taught.
Right. Nice. I love that when you were describing your childhood and your travels in your youth, that you use the phrase "once upon a time." There's a sense in which as soon as you set foot on the road, a story is about to be told. You don't have to be on the road for a story to be told, but the road demands a story.
Yeah.
A story is happening. An adventure even is happening. I really enjoy that you just use that phrase so casually. Now, before I actually ask you a question about your course, I would like to comment to those of you who are watching that you're very welcome to make comments and ask questions. And as we go along, we'll interact with them. And at the end of our time together, we will have a Q&A period as well. So definitely feel free to pipe in, and we look forward to your interactions. So, Andrew, you were talking about travel literature and travel books as a genre, right? And you think of your favorites, I think of my favorites, and of course there's so much overlap. Right? You mentioned explorers, and as a young man reading books about exploration, or military memoirs, there's there can be so much overlap. But certainly, or like Bill Bryson, books that are specifically about travel, it's still well, it's nonfiction, right? These are things that they're supposed to be transmitting an experience, right, and putting you in that place. But the literature you've selected for your courses, it's a mix.
It is.
And so I'm curious about the presence of the Odyssey and As I Lay Dying. But before you interact with that, though, would you remind the viewers, and I'll type it into chat, of the title of that life-changing book? Was it Walking the Nile?
It was Walking the Nile by Levison Wood,
which is it's on your reading list for this course.
It is. It's the last book in the course. And if you want me to address the previous question that you had, why I picked the text that I did.
Yes, please.
Why I picked them was that there is a progression with each of these texts. So the order is important here because we start with Exodus. And when we think of Exodus, the second book of the Bible, that's one of the places where we see travel literature really start. So travel literature as being, they're going on a journey, they're in peril, they're being oppressed by the Egyptians. They want to get out of Egypt. And so you've got Moses and you've got the Israelites wanting to get out. And so the Nile centers around that story. So we start with Moses going down the Nile, and he really, from the beginning of his life, is a traveler. He's traveling down the Nile. They find him. All of those things happen to him to create him being the leader or the kind of the hero of that journey. But you see hospitality, biblical hospitality, you see determination, you see perseverance, all of these things that center around travel literature and people, description of place. You even get some balladry in there in chapter 15, which I'll talk about too, just because I love the ballad. And it goes along with kind of the journey kind of theme there. But we start with Exodus, then we go to the Odyssey, because you have the same elements in the Odyssey that you have in Exodus. Biblical hospitality, determination, you've got a journey. Then you go to As I Lay Dying, because you see elements of biblical things that we've talked about, hospitality, a journey. Even if you going back to Genesis, thinking about when they buried their dead, they would go back to kind of their homeland to bury their dead. So,
that's a really interesting parallel between those two. Wow. Okay.
So when you see As I Lay Dying, you see biblical elements and you see Homeric elements, because in As I Lay Dying, the point of the story is they're going back to bury Addie Bundren. But when they go back to bury Addie Bundren, they run into some things that are very Homeric in nature that you'll see in the Odyssey. And so you'll see both of those kinds of things in As I Lay Dying. Then we get to the more modern text of Walking the Nile, Levison Wood. And I chose to do it this way because we are book-ending Nile texts, as I call them. So the students will see the Nile in an ancient form in Exodus, but they'll see it in a more modern form in Levison's text, which there's a lot of overlap there, because the biblical hospitality theme that you see in Exodus, you also see in Levison's book, and he walked the Nile in 2014. So there's a systematic order with the text, because each one kind of builds on the next. You learn about the foundational piece in Exodus, and then that builds with each text that we use.
Right. And I love the structure where you actually have bookending. Your comments about As I Lay Dying make me want. I'm gonna ask you shortly about Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?
Yeah.
Have you read Travels with Charlie? So I'm looking at the book list, and I can tell Kimberly, my wife, Giant's wife, that Travels with Charlie is not on the reading list. But I wonder if you've read it and if you're able to interact with that title at all.
I have not read Travels with Charlie, but I do love Steinbeck. Steinbeck he was a central part of my dissertation or my thesis on ballads, just because I focused on Woody Guthrie as being one of the preservers of the ballad, and you see Guthrie using Steinbeck's ballad of Tom Joad in his record of Dust Bowl ballads. But if you think about travel literature in Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath could also be considered travel literature in a sense, because you've got the Joads coming from Oklahoma going to California, and you've also got the hero kind of figure of Tom Joad leading that procession to California. Which, if you think about that book and you think about the kind of the transition you had in the beginning, you had Pa Joad kind of leading the way, and then about halfway through, Ma Joad takes the lead, and she's really kind of the figurehead of the whole caravan there, and then she worries about Tom Joad just because of what happens later on in the book. And for those of you that have not read the book, I won't spoil what happens. But he has this kind of Odysseus kind of thing about him, where he's wanting to embark on this journey, and a lot of things happen to him, to happen to the whole family. So that to me also could be considered travel literature, even though it's not technically travels with whoever, but it's somebody going on a journey. And part of the definition of travel literature would be you've got a protagonist going on a journey or quest. So that definitely fits in.
So, at the beginning of this conversation, you relating how your life was changed by reading about travel. What is your motivation for wanting to teach young people a course about travel literature as opposed to just great literature, right? Because I mean, the Odyssey or As I Lay Dying will be on reading lists for high school students,
Right.
but obviously you're coming at it with a particular agenda. Why is it important to you?
I think the genre of travel literature is so important because it's so multifaceted, because it teaches you about so many different things. You learn about people, you learn about cultures, you learn about geography. I've learned more geography in reading travel literature just in reading myself than I ever learned in school, because reading travel literature and learning geography that way, it's more active. It's not as static as you looking on a map and seeing, okay, that's where Russia is, or that's where China is, or that's where Argentina is. But you see these people walking through or traveling through these places, and you can follow their journey on a map and learn more about people and culture and geography in that way. And you learn more about the people of that country, of that culture, from a person who's really on the ground talking to actual people. So even when you're, watching the news or see something happening in one of these, Arabic countries or one of the countries that we're not so familiar with, but you've read about it, you can have an idea of what the people are actually going through because you've read this travel literature from a person who's talking to people, who's going through and really interacting with the actual people. And you learn that we're not really all that different from people that are halfway across the world from us. So I think it teaches us a lot of different things. It teaches us perspective because it lets us look at a culture that's not our own, but we can see similarities to our own culture and we can connect with these people. So
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of connection there that travel literature provides that you may not get in other forms of literature.
Right. But I think interestingly, what travel literature provides is an external perspective, right? One that is as alien as yours, but this writer went there and you didn't.
Yeah.
Right? One of our recent teacher conversations, Wendell Berry came up. And Wendell Berry is a Southern agrarian writer who, he has collections of poetry that he just writes on the Sabbath under a tree. He has a lot of essays on agriculture and on homesteading. He has beautiful novels that are they take place over generations in one place, and there's a sense of place to his novels. Honestly, I find quite overwhelming. I grew up moving and traveling a lot, and there's a sense in which I'll never be able to connect with that viscerally. But I mean, I have to acknowledge when I come across literature like that there's just such a powerful sense of place, and that it has an impact on the reader. When we talk about travel literature, what is having the impact? Is it the places that we're traveling to, or is it the journey itself? And I'm not trying to be, I don't want to be like too shaded and too nuanced in the question. Well, I guess what I'm asking is the impact coming because I've been put somewhere else, or is the impact coming because of the trip?
I think the impact is coming. I think it's twofold. It's coming because you've been put somewhere else, and also because you're connecting with people that you probably, if you were to think about it, in the country that you're from, that you wouldn't connect with. So going to that place and seeing people really living lives much the same that you would live, and really connecting with those people on a people level, that's something that I think that you connect with, just because you don't really understand that we're very similar. So when you're put into that place and you see this place isn't that much different from where I was, and the people aren't that much different, and they may even be a little bit nicer than the people I got away from. Because when you're walking, when Levison's walking the Nile, and I'm going to talk about this in the course, when we see Exodus, we see a lot of biblical hospitality, like where they're traveling, they don't have really much food or any place to stay, and people give them food and a place to stay. So that was really a fabric of biblical culture, is if a traveler needed something, somebody would give them, a food or a place to stay. And that still holds true in 2014, Levison Walking the Nile. There's a piece in that book that I just love where he's walking the Nile. He doesn't really see there's really not a lot of people. He doesn't really know where he's going to stay. He and his guide, really kind of just out in the middle of nowhere along the Nile. He runs into this farmer. They get to talking. The farmer says, have you eaten, or where are you going to stay? And he said, well, I don't know. We're just going to kind of sleep outside because we don't really have any place to stay. He says, well, no, you're coming to stay with me. So he feeds him and he says, you're staying with me. And Levison looks at Boston, his guide, and the house isn't really that big. And the guy goes in his house, brings out his own bed and gives it to Levison and goes and sleeps on the floor. And Levison is just brought to tears because this act of hospitality from a guy who he just met, he's thinking this would happen nowhere else. I could go back to London or any part of England and, need something and somebody would be that gracious or that nice to me. So you still see that fabric of biblical hospitality kind of just ingrained in the people of that area.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because a lot of what you're saying is touching on a hobby horse of mine. As someone who has traveled pretty extensively and lived in various places, I actually react kind of negatively against a commonplace that I've heard often. People will say or suggest that travel makes you a better person. And I vehemently disagree with that. As if it were some sort of magical pill that I'm going to go to Paris and I'm going to come back and I'm going to be a better human. Well, for us, with reality, more Christ-like because I went to Paris. But that's it's so beneficial to travel and to be exposed to different cultures and the different ways they do things, all the things that you have in common, the different modes of thinking, that we can be tricked into thinking that we have to travel to achieve a certain level. And we don't. There is so much that you can do in one place to build a deeply textured life. And that includes reading. Mm-hmm. If you read a lot, you're having experience. Yeah. You can live so many lives through books. And I know it sounds like a cliche, but it's really like reading books in other places takes you to other places. Maybe not to exactly, like you read a book about the Balkans, you can't say you've been to the Balkans, but you have been impacted by the Balkans. You've been changed. So neither reading the book nor traveling makes you a better person. And we shouldn't be tricked into thinking that, but we should value the impact that these things can have in our lives. That's a little hobby horse of mine, and I apologize for hijacking the stream on you for a little bit. So Scott mentioned a particular book, A Time for Gifts by Patrick Lee Fermer. And as I was preparing for this stream, I was thinking of a favorite, probably my favorite travel book, which was Black Lamb, Gray Falcon by Rebecca West. But, so what makes a travel book, I guess, is the question. So we don't have to be familiar necessarily with A Time for Gifts or Black Lamb, Gray Falcon. But, like Black Lamb, Gray Falcon is a huge tome, and it's all like a memoir. But it's, this woman and her husband go to Yugoslavia in the 1930s, and she writes this immense, powerful book about her experiences. So, so it's a memoir. And of course, it happens while she's traveling. But there's no sense of odyssey. With Time for Gifts, there's a lot of traveling around. But I don't know, like I'm curious to know, so Scott's asking here, would a book like that be considered travel literature or something else? And I know if you haven't read this, then you'd be a little handicapped in answering. So I guess approaching it from another angle, is the act of traveling enough to make a travel book?
The genre is so vast because you have so many different kind of areas of travel literature. And you've got the explorers, but you've also got the people maybe like a Bill Bryson, who don't necessarily go, to other parts of the world. They stay somewhat in, America and Britain, but they're traveling or, around town, or they're exploring their own, wherever they are. So I think anything could be considered a travel book if someone is exploring something, whether it's, themselves or a place or a culture or a people. But if they're exploring something, whatever that is, I would consider that a travel book, because they're going on some sort of a journey. So there's a French scholar named Mathilde Amar, who teaches at the University of Kent, and her definition is that a book has to have a protagonist that goes on a journey or a quest. So using her definition, we can say that if somebody's even going on a quest themselves, not just, it may be mental or physical, they're still traveling because they're still trying to figure something out, or they're still exploring some parts of themselves.
So the classic hero's journey idea, right, is, do you need a hero's journey then for a travel book? Is that what you're saying? Or because the hero's journey, it has a life of its own, I guess.
It does, and it plays a role, but you don't necessarily need kind of a hero's journey, because if you think about something like Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, where you've got this Bildungsroman of you've got a character who starts one way, and then you see this progression of this character, and by the time you get to the end of the book, he's a completely different character than he was at the beginning. So it's not necessarily that he was a hero on some sort of a quest, but he was on a journey, that either, I don't know if you want to say improves the person, but it changes the person because of what they go through. So in that way, even Invisible Man could be considered somewhat of a travel book, because he goes through all of these different phases of his life.
So I'd love to hear a little more about your use of Exodus in this class. So travel literature through the ages, being offered this fall at Kepler. And you're using Exodus. I believe you said chapter 15 was one you would comment on.
Yeah. 1 through 15. I chose that because it's really, if you start from the beginning, you see what a prevalent force the Nile is, in beginning that story. And then you also get to see biblical hospitality. You get to see determination. You get to see decision-making from the Israelites. What are we going to do to get out of the situation that we're in? And then you also see in chapter 15 a ballad-like structure where they really, in poetic form, go through what the Israelites went through in that 15th chapter. So, and we'll talk about a little bit of that, how that fits in to Exodus. But that's why I chose Exodus, because it sets up everything else that we're doing in the course, from the Odyssey to Faulkner to Lewis and Wood. But you're building that foundation in Exodus to then see these things come again and again and again. And even in a modern text like Levison's Walking the Nile, you still see those foundational pieces when you read that book.
And there's a sense in which we have to confront the fact that life is a journey, right? That we're strangers in a strange land, that this country is not our own, all the different ways that we as Christians can have to come to terms with that, even if we are born, grow up, and die in the same holler, in the same valley, and in the same place as our ancestors always have. There's an aspect of our lives as part of the people of God, and then of course the people of God themselves, that is travel. It's all about travel.
Yeah, we are all we're all on a personal journey or an individual journey. Even if we don't move anywhere, you can still get out and explore your own hometown. There are parts of Cookeville, Tennessee, that I have not explored, and I've lived here for going on 15 years now. So you can still, even if you don't go out of the country or out of the state, there's still some exploration and some growth that can come from just exploring where you are. And Bryson talks about that in this book, A Sense of Place here by Michael Shapiro. A wonderful book of interviews dealing with some of the great travel writers and how they write and how they really do their craft. But he talks about just go exploring where you are and let that be the starting point. Don't think you need to go somewhere big and grandiose to be a traveler.
Yeah, actually, that I think is a fascinating point, that the best way to connect to your own place is to do it justice as not only as a denizen, but as a tourist even, right? To put your eyeballs on it and dedicate your mind and your spirit to the place. So, for example, if you don't know the history of the Native American peoples who lived in your neck of the woods, that's probably something that you want to remedy to be, I suppose, bettering one's education, but also connecting yourself to the place. And then after that, knowing what kind of crops grow here. Do you not know what kind of crops grow here? What kind of trees grow here? Who were the first immigrants to come from Europe that settled here? How did African Americans get here? How did this language get to be spoken here? I mean, in South Carolina, there are several German-speaking enclaves to this day. How did that happen?
Yeah.
Right. And if you're from South Carolina, it's good to know that, to really, you're traveling without going anywhere, because it helps anchor you to the place that you want to belong to. But then on the other hand, when you travel, you can create a real connection by learning about a place, by eating its food, etc.
Yeah. And you talked about Wendell Berry and his connection to that sense of place. You see that a lot in Faulkner as well, with Faulkner South, and you'll see that in As I Lay Dying. He creates this sense of place where you get a sense of, what his South was like, or what South was like in Mississippi in that time that he was writing. And so the connection to place in Faulkner, I mean, for somebody like me who lives in the southern United States, that can really relate to those kinds of things, and my grandparents can relate to those kinds of things and have told me stories like that. I think that's why I connect so deeply with Faulkner, is because it reminds me of those stories that my grandparents told me that they, that they lived through, that I'm not going to live through, but through Faulkner, I can kind of get a sense of what that may have been like for them. And so even though you can't travel back in time, you can hear the stories of other people, and you can read that in certain texts. And I think that's why, going back to the ballad, that's why I like the ballad so much, is it does the same thing. It connects you to the story of a time that you're not going to be able to experience, but you can experience through the ballad, which all a ballad is a song that tells a story. And some of those are the greatest kind of travel pieces that you can hear in song, because you can really know what a person's going through, a connection to people, connection to whatever place they're in. So those two things, I think, really can connect you to that sense of place as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, so talking about the South and a sense of place, you have a passion for folk music, particularly Appalachian folk music.
I do. I have a podcast called Up on the Mountain with Andrew Chaney. I've done that since probably, master's level graduate work. I started that a little before I started my master's degree, and I've done 63 interviews so far. It's still ongoing now. I started a PhD through Faulkner University, so it's been put on hiatus a little bit, but I'm still very much invested in that musical genre, in that, what that music has to offer, the folk music, the bluegrass, traditional music, that I've gotten to interview a lot of different people and connected with a lot of different people and places through that music. I got to go a lot of different places and see them play and meet the people that I interviewed, which was really cool. So in that way, I'm traveling as well. But that music really special to me. It was my grandfather who introduced me to that type of music and got me to play the mandolin. He was playing the banjo. He retired at 71, started playing the banjo at 71, and got me to play the mandolin. And we had a little jam group for going on for a long, long time. and had a lot of fun doing that. But that got me into the music, and then I got into the history and the culture that is that music, because it's so much the fabric of American culture. When you think about where music comes from, it all generally starts with American folk music or traditional bluegrass music. There's a quote in The Last Waltz, the documentary that Martin Scorsese did about the band, where Lee Von Helm is going through all these different genres of music, and he's saying, well, this place has the blues, this place has jazz, or this place has swing. And then Scorsese asks him, well, what happens when all those things come together? And he said, well, that's rock and roll. So you've got this foundational piece that when you kind of look back to where those people are coming from, like the Rolling Stones, or a lot of these rock bands, are the Grateful Dead, are founded in this love for American folk music, and that leads them to expand upon it. So that kind of base of American folk music and its fabric in the culture really was interesting to me. So learning about that was really, really cool.
Yeah, it's really interesting, as you kind of expound upon your love for these types of music and for American folk music. You're not traveling to Patagonia, you're not traveling to the Kalahari, you're traveling the Appalachians, you're traveling east of the Mississippi, and you're going deep. And you're going deep into a particular thing, and that's building connections for you to the land, to the culture, through time, right, across generations. And so it really isn't about the distance or how grueling or how easy the journey might be. It's about the dedication to having a traveling mindset, I think.
And I think what both of those things do, and I think what really attracts me to both of those things, is the connection you can have with other people through traveling, through music. When you go to a festival, most of the time you would bring your instrument, and I don't usually bring my instrument because I'm not that good. But you'll see people that do that and go and jam with other people at these festivals, and there's a connection there. You meet people that you've never met before, and they become friends of yours because of how you meet them at these festivals. You go to these jam camps, learning how to play with other people, and you meet them that way as well, and can connect with them through the music that you both love so much. So that also happens in travel, when you realize that you're connecting through a part of the culture, that may be similar. So a part of American culture that may be similar to, if you're going, Bruce Chatwin going to Patagonia, he sees part of the Patagonian people are, these Welsh immigrants that have immigrated or come to Patagonia from Wales, and seeing that kind of connection, he can connect with these people and have that same kind of connection, because there's a similarity there, because they are invested in a lot the same thing. So music and travel both provide this sense of connection, and I think that's the biggest part of what travel can teach us, is being connected, or how much we are connected to other people.
Yeah, absolutely. And music is just one of the things that can just really resonate, forgive the pun, when you travel. But food can do it. There are so many ways that the senses can participate in the process that you're talking about. Guys, as we get to the end of this stream and of this wonderful conversation, now is a great time to post any questions or comments that you might have. We really appreciate everyone's interaction so far. And if you have ever really wished that you or your child could take a class in which you would both cross the Red Sea and visit the Mississippi, then this is the class for you. How's that for a sales pitch, huh?
That's perfect. Yeah.
So while we give folks a chance to maybe ask any last questions, I wonder if you have any travel plans this summer.
No, I think this summer I'm taking some PhD courses through Faulkner, so I'll be traveling through that literature and reading some. We're reading some Richard Wagner, some opera, some of those musical types of things. Doing some plays. art, talking about some art and this fine arts course that I'm taking through Faulkner. So really focused on the PhD journey this summer.
Yeah.
More than
that is an epic journey for sure.
It is.
So is this a full year class?
This is a semester course. So for the semester, it's $400 per student for the semester. So that will be a 15-week semester course.
And half a credit.
Yeah, half a credit.
Yeah, I think the idea behind this class is really very exciting to me. And I'm going to have to convince you to maybe in the spring semester just do one on travel memoirs.
That would be good. That would be good. I mean, the memoir is also a very interesting genre just in of itself. I took a course when I was in graduate school on the memoir, and we read things like The Woman Warrior, An Autobiography of a Face, which themselves are travel in their own way. So doing something on the travel memoir, or like a Mary Rowlandson, that she was captured by the Indians. The Indians really took her under her wing, and then she comes back and she doesn't really know what to do because she's been a part of this Indian culture. So when she gets back to her more, for lack of a better term, normal culture that people think she should be involved in, she misses her Indian captors because she's been so indoctrinated to this culture. So that's another area of the travel literature scope that you can take, is the travel memoir for sure. Yeah,
cool. Well, Andrew, I'm really glad you were able to stop by and chat with us. Hopefully we can do this again soon. And I hope that your summer of your PhD odyssey is not too grueling.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun.
My pleasure. Now, as I end this live, feel free to stay on because you and I will be able to speak offline. Meanwhile, to everyone watching, thanks so much for being here.